Hey, everybody. Well, on today's episode of the podcast, after taking a couple of weeks break from the book of John, we are returning back. We're back in action in the book of John. And a couple of weeks ago, we finished up John chapter 5. So we're ready to dive into John chapter 6. And as I've mentioned, as I've said before, we're in for some really good things in John chapter 6. And I said that I couldn't wait to dive into this chapter. So here we are. We've arrived. John chapter 6 is a lengthy chapter, so we will be in here for a minute. And by a minute, I'm thinking probably at least 3 episodes, possibly pushing into 4. But I don't want to rush through anything because I really want us to gather in the richness of what Jesus provides for us here in this passage. And so just like in chapter 5, in chapter 6, we have a situation where the chapter starts out with a miracle, and then from that miracle, we have a long discourse by Jesus, okay? A discourse that stems from what he has done in the miracle. So you kind of see a little bit of similarity between chapter 5 and chapter 6 as far as that's concerned. A difference, though, that we see between the two is that whereas in chapter 5, with Jesus healing the invalid at the pool, what resulted immediately, once his Jewish enemies found out that he had healed a man on the Sabbath, and hearing Jesus say that my Father is working until now and I am working, there's this immediate negative reaction to Jesus, both in what he has done and what he has said, which prompts Jesus to go into all the things that he describes from verse 19 all the way to the end of the chapter. And again, we went through all of that for a handful of weeks. Here in John chapter 6, you see something that initially, and even before and after the miracle, you see a great deal of positivity. And so somebody who may not be familiar with the text or is reading through John for the first time might look at this and might think, wow, something really great is happening, and look at how all these people are receiving him. But what we're going to see is that eventually, and we'll see this by the time we get to the end of the chapter, there isn't a full-hearted reception of Jesus and who he is, but there's rejection, and many of the people that were very excited about him before end up turning their backs on him and walking away from him. So there's rejection on that end. So you see a difference between the two that ultimately leads to the same thing as far as rejection from everybody else, but the 12 remaining with him, and Peter specifically, one who's saying, to whom shall we go? You're the one who has the words of eternal life. Now, that difference between all these other people who were his disciples who eventually abandoned him, and then the 12, technically the 11, because Jesus himself says one of you is a devil, and he's talking about Judas. The difference between those two, we're gonna kind of even see, even here, just kind of near the beginning portion of John chapter 6. It's kind of an overlap between what we're going to look at in this episode and what we'll continue to see in the next episode. But again, you're going to see a difference between what goes on with the crowd and what they think and say about Jesus after the miracle, and then the disciples. And that's really going to clue us in on the difference between the two. And that's where you're going to have a great deal of those people who experienced the miracle of Jesus feeding the 5,000. That's what he does. That's the miracle that we're going to look at today. And the disciples who stick with him even after everything that he says afterwards. Okay. So like I said, some good things in store. So this miracle, again, the miracle that we're looking at is the feeding of the 5,000. Is what leads into, is what is eventually going to lead into what Jesus is going to talk about through much of this chapter. Okay, so with that being said, the verses that we're going to be looking at in this episode is verses 1 through 15. And so let me read that for you, and then we'll get into the text here. So John chapter 6, verses 1 through 15. And it says, after this, Jesus went away to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias. And a large crowd was following him because they saw the signs that he was doing on the sick. Jesus went up on the mountain, and there he sat down with his disciples. Now the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was at hand. Lifting up his eyes then, and seeing that a large crowd was coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, Where are we to buy bread so that these people may eat? He said this to test him, for he himself knew what he would do. Philip answered him, 200 denarii worth of bread would not be enough for each of them to get a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what is that for so many? Jesus said, Have the people sit down. Now there was much grass in the place, so the men sat down, about 5,000 in number. Jesus then took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated. So also the fish, as much as they wanted. And when they had eaten their fill, he told his disciples, Gather up the leftover fragments, that nothing may be lost. So they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with fragments from the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten. When the people saw the sign that he had done, they said, This is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world. Perceiving then that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, Jesus withdrew again to the mountain by himself. My name is Steve Gill, and you're listening to Loving the Scriptures. All right. Well, before we dive into the text, just to go over some of the preliminaries, the usual preliminaries, with me just telling you that if you enjoy this program and you haven't done so already, please be sure to follow and subscribe wherever you listen to your podcasts, wherever you listen to this podcast. And then also be sure to follow me on X. My handle is @LTScripts. That's LTSCRIPTS. Which stands for Loving the Scriptures. And also don't forget to order a copy of my book if you haven't done so already, Signs of the End, What Did Jesus Say About His Own Return and the Events That Point to It, a book about Jesus' words to his disciples in the Olivet Discourse. So we're talking Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21. So as usual, I'll leave a link in the episode description so you can click on that and it'll take you to an order page. I hope you read it and I hope that you're blessed by it. Okay, so the feeding of the 5,000, I don't recall if I had mentioned this before. If I did, then I'm repeating myself. If I didn't, then obviously it's my first time mentioning this. And if I had mentioned this would have been near the end of last episode. When I was just talking about what was ahead for us going forward. Right, so as I just read to you from John chapter 6 is the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000, and this is the only miracle in the book of John that you see in all the other synoptic gospels, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. One of the things that I had pointed out and I had mentioned to you way back in the beginning when we started this study is that, John lays out here miracles done by Jesus that are, that are unique to him, just as far as what he lays forth narratively that you don't see in the other synoptic accounts. Which is fine because, as John will point out at the end of his book, Jesus did a lot of things that, you couldn't even record all of it because he did so many things. So obviously there's a lot of things in the synoptic gospels that aren't mentioned in the synoptics, that aren't even mentioned in John either. So, the Holy Spirit leading John to write these things down and using these miracles, he selects these for John to write down for us for a specific purpose. But even so, when you come to this whole thing of John chapter 6 and the feeding of the 5,000 and the fact that this is one miracle that you also see in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, perhaps you kind of get a sense that this is a very much a significant miracle. And it's probably, one might speculate perhaps that the reason why that is because it touched so many people all at once. Okay. And so, this is something that obviously amazed the people Granted that most of the people really still at that point didn't have a true understanding of Jesus and who he is. But still, at the same time, they understood the situation at hand. They understood that they were in a place where there was no food and no resources, or hardly any resources. They had very, very small resources, 5 loaves and 2 fish. And Jesus is able to feed 5,000 people, 5,000 men. That's not even including women and children, right? And providing enough food so that everybody can have their fill. We're not talking about people who are just eating crumbs here and there and getting a little bit of satisfaction before going on their journey home or wherever they were planning on going. We're talking about a full out meal, just kind of enough to fill your belly, enough for you to be satisfied out of that small of resources. And that tells people something. So if we're talking about something that is done that directly affects over 5,000 people, I mean, this is something that is that's a pretty significant act. And again, I want to be careful here because I don't want to suggest that all the other miracles that Jesus did are less significant or not very significant or anything like that. I don't want to give that impression at all. So please don't hear me saying that. But again, it is something that the Holy Spirit found necessary to include in all four Gospels, in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And when you understand the fact that this is something that directly affected over 5,000 people, it's pretty significant. Now, as it relates to the book of John specifically, what we're going to see, and this isn't going to be on this episode, but this is going to be as we progress through John chapter 6. The reason why something like this in the book of John, this account is included in here, is because, obviously we're talking about bread, physical bread, and Jesus feeding these people bread, of course, along with fish. But on the heels of that, Jesus is going to talk about himself being the bread of life, and this whole thing of bread being used to talk about spiritual things. And remember, we've seen Jesus do this before. I mean, it's one thing. It's a very interesting thing as far as it relates to Jesus as he speaks to people or as he evangelizes to people or what have you, using things in the moment to make a spiritual point. The one that you remember, and remember we talked about this a while back when we were in there. But in John chapter 4, when we're talking about when Jesus is talking to the Samaritan woman about springs of living water welling up to eternal life, why is he talking about water and living water? He says everybody who drinks this water will be thirsty again, but the water that I will give him, if you drink from that, you'll never be thirsty. Why is he using this whole thing of water? Well, because they're at a well. And there's water in the well. And so Jesus uses that situation of being at the well with the woman and using water as an illustration to make a powerful spiritual point. And that's the thing that we're going to see here in John chapter 6. And even with, talking about bread from heaven, which is talking about the manna that you read about in the Old Testament as the Israelites were wandering through the wilderness. And then Jesus making a comparison between himself as the true bread from heaven compared to the bread that came down from heaven during the time of Moses in the Old Testament. And Jesus saying, essentially saying, I am the better bread, Everybody who ate of the bread that came down from heaven, the manna, who ate from the manna, they eventually died, right? It wasn't anything that gave them sustaining life that have them live forever. They still ate for sustenance, but they actually died. Jesus, continuing on with the bread illustration, is one who's saying that I am the true bread that comes down from heaven. And he talks about taking him in as a true bread, and anybody who eats of that bread will eat forever. Okay, so that's what we have here. But then again, what we see is all of this is stemming from this miracle that involves bread and fish, and the feeding of this multitude of people. Okay, so that's what we're dealing with here. So as we get into this text here, notice how it starts out here, where it says, "After this, Jesus went away to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias. Now, he says after this, and again, remember what we looked at in chapter 5. Chapter 5, again, at the beginning of that chapter, we saw the miracle of Jesus healing the invalid by the pool, and then that discourse of him talking about him and the Father, and pretty much talking about the unity between the Father and the Son. The Son does nothing, that apart from the Father, essentially. All of this pointing out and pointing to the reality that Jesus Christ himself is God, okay? We talked extensively about all those things. If you want to go back and listen to those episodes, if you haven't heard them, I would strongly encourage you to do that. And even if you did, it doesn't hurt to go back and review those things as well. Some very powerful and rich things that we went through in John chapter 5. Now here in John chapter 6, when it says after this, I think one thing to understand is that it's not saying that this is something that happened immediately after this. And we know that just given the setting that we're now in John chapter 6, where it says Jesus went away on the other side of the Sea of Galilee. So the Sea of Galilee is north in Galilee. What we saw in John chapter 5 was in Jerusalem, in Judea, in the south. Okay. And as you read a little bit later, when we read the passage here in John chapter 6, it's saying that the Passover was at hand. Okay. So we saw in John chapter 5, at the very beginning in verse 1, that there was a feast of the Jews, and that prompted Jesus to go down to Jerusalem. So we see that there's a passage of time between John chapter 5 and John chapter 6. It's not, so when he says after this, it's not an immediate after this. Now how much time are we talking about here? It depends on what the Feast of the Jews is in John chapter 5, whether you're talking about the Feast of Tabernacles or another Passover. I doubt that John chapter 5, the feast that's being referred to, is the Passover, simply because John is pretty consistent in specifically laying out Passover and when it is or when it's coming up or something like that. Good example of that is we saw that in chapter 2. John says the Passover, it was time for the Passover, so Jesus went to Jerusalem. So John is when it comes to Passover, he's rather specific. Whereas here it's not so much. He just says a feast of the Jews. So if we're talking about another feast, and again more than likely probably what you're talking about is the Feast of Tabernacles, perhaps, then we're talking about maybe about 6 months time between what we saw in John chapter 5 and what we're seeing now in John chapter 6. And again, everything that we saw and heard in John chapter 5 in the south in Jerusalem, here in John chapter 6 in the north. Now, again, one thing that I've pointed out in the past is that most of John's focus of Jesus' ministry takes place in the south. That's not to say that Jesus didn't do a lot of things up north. He did. Those are a lot of things that are covered in the synoptics. But here's one of the few areas within the book of John where we see activity in the north. Now, we've already been in the north before, and we actually have seen signs in the north before. So changing the water into wine in Cana, that's north. And then also the healing of the official son, that's also in the north in Galilee. Here we are back again in Galilee. So we do see a few places where Jesus has, in the book of John, where there's activity from Jesus in Galilee. So as it says here in this opening verse, after this, Jesus went away to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias. And the Sea of Tiberias, that's another name, obviously, as John is laying out here. Probably the name that John's primary audience would have been more familiar with. They would have been more familiar with the name of the sea being called that, as opposed to the Sea of Galilee. And so that's why he expounds on that and says, this, what you would also know probably as the Sea of Tiberias. There was a city on the western coast of the Sea of Galilee that's named Tiberias. So that's probably where they get that other name from. And so that's why it's probably also called that as well. So it says here, as we go further into verse 2, it says, "And a large crowd was following him because they saw the signs that he was doing on the sick." And this is this isn't surprising because, again, we've seen this before as well. We've seen the positive results of Jesus doing signs, and specifically in John, this was laid out in chapter 2, and that had a lot to do with Jesus doing things in the south during the Passover. So he was in Jerusalem in Judea, but you see the same thing up north here in Galilee, and so large crowds were following him because of the signs. And so that was, you can kind of get a sense that this was the consistent thing that Jesus had, just as he was going about Galilee, that he was being followed throughout his Galilean ministry because, people had either heard or they had witnessed with their own eyes certain miracles or signs that Jesus was doing, healing people, perhaps raising people from the dead and that sort of thing. And so that would just draw more and more people in. Obviously, a lot of other people probably seeking him out so that they can receive healing themselves, or that they could heal, or that he can heal somebody else, a loved one, or something like that. So again, like I said, we see kind of some similar things between what we see here in John chapter 6 and what we saw at the end of John chapter 2. Now, we can see this kind of in a broad sense of the crowd following Jesus around because he was healing the sick, but we can also see this in a more narrow sense, in a more immediate context, because again, what we're talking about here with the feeding of the 5,000, and this is something that's pretty much consistent in the Synoptic Gospels as well, is that there were signs being done by the disciples right before this point. If you read in the Synoptics, you see that Jesus sends out the 12 to the different regions, different villages in Israel to preach the kingdom, and he gave them power to heal the sick and to drive out demons and that sort of thing. And so word about that got around, and so people were beginning to wonder, and they were beginning to talk, and they were trying to figure out what's going on here, what's to explain all of these things. So Jesus sent out these disciples 2 by 2. And by the way, when you're seeing these and you're reading these in the Synoptics, pretty much what you're seeing there is you see this in Matthew 9, Mark chapter 6, and in Luke chapter 9. Okay, so specifically though, if we're talking about the words of an individual person as it relates to trying to figure out who Jesus is, it was King Herod. In each of those, in those Gospels, Synoptic Gospels, Herod, heard about all that's going on. Again, as the disciples are going out and they're performing these signs, no doubt in the name of Jesus. And so what Herod is speculating, though, even though you have 12 people out there 2 by 2 doing these things, Herod and pretty much everybody else is associating it with one man. Okay, which I think is very interesting. Herod associating it specifically with John the Baptist. He's one who says, wait, I put John the Baptist to death. I mean, am I dealing with John the Baptist who's been raised from the dead? So he has his mind focused on a man, while others associated this with other men, but also just focusing on one man. They're saying, well, it's possible that we're dealing with Elijah, or we're dealing with one of the prophets. I mean, for example of that, you can look specifically at Luke 9:8. But even so, in all of this speculation and everything that's going on, a great number of people still understood Jesus to be Jesus, not Jesus as Elijah or Jesus as John the Baptist. They understood Jesus as Jesus. They'd seen some of the things that he had done even before he sent out the 12. And these were people who were going out and following him and seeking after him. Okay, so in verse 3, back in John chapter 6, it says, verse 3 says, Jesus went up on the mountain, and there he sat down with his disciples. Okay, so when Jesus going up on the mountain and sitting down with his disciples, let me say something really quick about this term disciples here, because disciples in this context probably doesn't mean just the 12. It probably means more than just the 12. Simply, and you get a clue of that. And by the way, when we're talking about disciples, the word disciples, A disciple just means somebody who is a learner. Okay. And that's in its very simple form. That's what a disciple is. So when you're talking specifically about the 12, I mean, we are dealing with 12 people who could be considered learners, because again, that's what disciples are: learners, followers of a particular person, if we want to look at it that way as well. And so you have all these people who are going and following Jesus around, because these are people who could be considered disciples, because this one thing that we see here, and you get more of a sense of this when you read the synoptics, is that Jesus not only healed their sick, but he spoke to them about the kingdom. So there was a matter of Jesus speaking and teaching and people listening as well. And so in a very real technical sense, these could be considered people who were his disciples. Specifically here in John chapter 6, if you look, for example, in verse 60, verse 60 and 61, when many of his disciples heard it, they said, "This is a hard saying. Who can listen to it?" Verse 61, but Jesus, knowing in himself that his disciples were grumbling about this, said to them, "Do you take offense at this?" So the disciples that are referenced here are the disciples that had been part of Jesus' miracle before. They had followed him to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, pretty much seeking out more free food, hearing what Jesus had to say, and then being turned off by it. Okay. And then when you look in verse 66, where it says, after this, many of his disciples turned back and no longer walked with him. Okay. Now, is that meaning the 12? No, because you get the clue in the very next verse. So Jesus said to the 12, "Do you want to go away as well?" So there you see, even in those few verses in John chapter 6, when it's talking about disciples, we're talking about a larger group of people who, as we've seen at the beginning of this chapter, were following him around. And they were following him, granted, yes, for his miracles, but these were more than likely people who were hearing the things that he had to say and the things that he was teaching as well. So that's what you have going on there as far as disciples. So when Jesus went up on the mountain, it says that he sat down with his disciples. We're talking about a large group of people. So as I mentioned before, he was one who healed their sick and spoke about the kingdom. You see that specifically in Luke chapter 9. And I believe the verse is verse 11, Luke chapter 9, verse 11. An additional detail, I guess, if you look at Matthew chapter 14, you have the whole thing of Jesus. It describes Jesus as having compassion for these people. All right. So Jesus has compassion for them. He heals their sick and he speaks to them about the kingdom. Okay. Now it says there back in John chapter 6, where in verse 4, it says, "Now the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was at hand." Okay. So one thing to understand, and this is probably the reason why that detail is slipped in there. I mean, if you read the passage as a whole, you might wonder why that is really even mentioned there. And I believe that, the reason why that is because Moses held a great deal of significance to the Jews. And when it came to the Passover, a lot of people in their minds focused on Moses. I mean, even when we're talking about anything having to do with the Exodus, the central character, humanly speaking, that a lot of people had their mind and their focus on was on Moses. And that's really not surprising. Remember what we saw at the end of chapter 5, is that Moses was one, as described in, I believe, verse 45, Moses on whom you have set your hope. One of the things that we said is that in the eyes of the Jews, Moses was held in very high esteem. Okay, so when it came to things like Passover, there was a lot of focus not only on everything that had happened in the saving of the Jews and the exodus of those people, but also the central figure within that whole story is Moses. And even beyond there, I think in a lot of cases, the meditation and contemplation on Moses and him leading the people through the wilderness and through the desert. So there's this broad sweeping understanding of what they were celebrating. And, the fact that Moses is a central figure in that is something that's very significant. So when John mentions here in John chapter 6 is that the Passover is at hand. And then as you even go further in verse 5, it says, lifting up his eyes then and seeing that a large crowd was coming to him. You get the sense that the nearness of Passover and what he was about to do, there's a connection there. So Jesus is set out to communicate something significant. I think he has set out to communicate something significant to both the crowd of people, we're talking about the multitudes here, and even specifically on a more narrow sense, his 12 disciples, his 12 handpicked disciples as well. We'll talk about that here in a little bit. You'll actually see this here, but so. As I said, so Moses held a great significance in Passover festival. It celebrated freedom and his leadership in the desert. So the Passover season serves, and again, we're going to see this as we go further and further into chapter 6, serves as a segue to the bread from heaven discussion that we're going to see here. And even what you're going to hear the crowd demand of Jesus, saying where he said, well, Moses did this, he did this, and essentially challenging Jesus and saying, can you do better than Moses? So there's something significant that Jesus is going to communicate here, and he's going to essentially communicate in pretty clear fashion, I would say, is that Jesus, as the bread of life, is somebody who is better than Moses. And if there's one thing that the Jews needed to hear at that time is that Jesus, as the Messiah, as the Son of God, is better than Moses. Okay, just by the fact that he identifies himself as the true bread from heaven. And also he says, by the way, Moses wasn't the one who provided the manna for you. And again, those are things that we're going to talk about once we get there. That's not going to be in this episode. It's probably going to be in the next one. But as it says here, so in verse 4 lays out that the feast of the Jews was at hand. And then in verse 5, he says, lifting up his eyes then and seeing that a large crowd was coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, where are we to buy bread so that these people may eat? Okay, so here's where we get into getting into the introduction of what we're going to see as far as this miracle that's going to be laid forth for the 12 disciples and for all the other disciples who have been following him. So in Matthew 14 and in Mark chapter 6, it says that the crowd was already waiting for Jesus in that region. In Luke chapter 9, it's specifically saying that they landed in Bethsaida. Okay, and that's where they actually settled. So here's what you have going on here, because again, remember in the synoptics, what you had was that Jesus sent out the 12, 2 by 2, to preach the kingdom and to heal the sick and to cast out demons and that sort of thing. And then they came back, and then Jesus says, let's go away to a desolate place by ourselves and get some rest. Now, again, like I said, in Matthew 14 and in Mark chapter 6, what you see is that when they get to where they're going, there's already a crowd waiting for them, because the crowd, heard of them leaving. And so they got to where they were going ahead of time. And so when Jesus lands, there's a crowd already there. And so he had compassion on them. Because they were like sheep without a shepherd and that sort of thing. So what we have here, again, if we go specifically into this whole thing of what it's saying here in verse 5, where he's saying that Jesus lifts up his eyes and sees a large crowd was coming, the way that we understand this is that this is even more people coming than the large crowd that's already there on the mountain sitting with Jesus, presumably hearing him talk about the kingdom or him healing or whatever like that. So you already have a large crowd. That's the multitude that's already there. Okay, when Jesus was ministering. And so then Jesus lifts up his eyes, and now he's seeing a larger crowd, I think is how we should understand this. So the crowd is growing even more. And so as the crowd is coming towards him, he asks Philip that question there. He says, where are we to buy bread so that these people may eat? And the reason why, Philip may have been singled out, was the fact that Philip was from Bethsaida. Remember, that's something that John pointed out in chapter 1. And this isn't a question that Jesus is asking just so he can get, familiar information from somebody who's local to the area, because Jesus has in mind what he's going to do. But again, I mean, if he asked anybody else, it might have been a whole thing of, I don't know, I have no idea what this whole thing is in the region or anything like that. He might have had a little bit more of what he was looking for as far as an answer that he was hoping to get from somebody like Philip, even somebody who knew the area. And so, we'll get to Philip's response here. But I mean, so hopefully you have the scene set in your head. Is that we're dealing with more and more people who are coming, and so try and see this from the eyes of the disciples themselves, the 12 disciples, and what they're witnessing, and seeing this great crowd of people. And now here comes Jesus, specifically in John, talking to Philip, and so where are we going to go to get food for these people? Okay. And the reason why, and again, this is laid out in verse 6, where it says, he said this to test him, for he himself knew what he would do. Okay. So Jesus is testing Philip. Now, one thing to understand, in the synoptics, Jesus tells the 12 to provide the food. Okay. If you read in the different synoptic accounts, the disciples are ones who come and I would say reasonably approach Jesus and say, hey, this is a desolate place. It's already getting late. Send the people away so that they can find food to eat, so that they don't grow faint on the way and that sort of thing. And then Jesus turns around and says, you give them something to eat. Okay. Now, here's the thing, because in John chapter 6, it's talking about a test. He's testing Philip. But really, in a sense, in the synoptics, you get a sense that the test is even broader. That covers, what is told to the other disciples, because and this whole thing of, Jesus saying, you give them something to eat. And so really, a lot of times when I hear this passage discussed, whether it's here in John or whether it's in the other synoptics in Matthew, Mark, or Luke, whether it's in a discussion or even if somebody's preaching on it, a lot of times the disciples get a little bit of criticism here. And they talk about their lack of faith and saying that, they see the situation at hand, they see a large multitude, they're given this task to give them, to feed all of these people, when they essentially really come down to the end of the day, almost have nothing. And so they're criticized for not saying, well, Jesus, we know that you're all powerful. We know that you can provide. So why don't you go ahead and provide these things? And the fact that the disciples didn't say that, for a lot of people is an indication of criticism towards them and saying they should have had more faith to be able to approach Jesus right back and say, why don't you do this? I'm going to cut them a little bit of slack. And if we use this whole term of test here, I'm going to say that the disciples, and maybe even Philip in particular, passes the test. Because again, just look at the words of Philip in verse 7 here of John chapter 6. It says, Philip answered him, 200 denarii worth of bread would not be enough for each of them to get a little. So Philip gets the huge nature of this whole thing. Jesus says, where are we to buy bread so that these people can eat? And so Philip just pulls out his calculator, starts crunching numbers and saying, okay, well, this, 200 denarii worth is not going to be enough even to get them a little. By the way, a denarius is a day's wage. So if we're talking about 200 denarii, we're talking about a significant amount of money here. And Philip is saying that this significant amount of money is not going to be enough to get even a little. So again, remember what I said before about people eating after this miracle and being satisfied? Philip is one here who's saying that, with that amount of money, which they probably didn't have anyway, but, Philip is just saying here, 200 denarii worth of this would not be enough to give them even a little. Okay. Whatever could be provided for them wouldn't be enough to bring any sort of satisfaction or anything like that. So again, whether you're talking about the disciples as a whole, and by that I'm talking about the 12 disciples, or even Philip specifically, I think you're dealing with the same thing here. And so people criticize him and saying, why didn't they just turn to Jesus and say, can't you do something? But I don't think that's the point of what Jesus is trying to do here. I think Jesus, because again, this was Jesus's idea. You get a sense of this here in John chapter 6. But again, like I said in the synoptics, Jesus is one who says, you guys, all of you give them something to eat. So they're hearing orders from their master and saying, fulfill this task. So the disciples are looking around and thinking, okay, what in the world, are we to do? And so they said, how are we going to feed these many people? I mean, there's a variation, I think, within the synoptics of what is said, but the idea is the same. And I think that their idea and what they're saying in the synoptics, and even what Philip says here, is an indication that they passed the test. And that in passing the test is essentially saying, I can't. Or if we're talking about the 12 together, we can't do that. All right. And there's something to be said about that. I don't know if any of you can identify with any sort of situation personally in your life where you felt like you were pushed up against the wall and you feel like God deliberately put you there. Now, listen, I don't have time to tell you stories, but I can tell you an instance or two in my life where I feel like I'm put against the wall and things seem impossible. And it seems like from a human point of view that it's up to me to solve this issue, to solve this problem. And I'm one who has to go before the Lord, and I confess openly, Lord, I can't. And that, in a lot of cases, is a good place to be. And God wants us to acknowledge that and acknowledge in saying that you can't. And then, just like here, when people say, I can't, God says, okay, great. You understand your inability to do things on your own. You understand your total dependence on me. Now let me show you, now that you have the full picture that you can't, now let me show you how much I can. And I think that's the point here. I think it's in Matthew's account where the disciples essentially say, where are we going to, how can we get bread and, for all of these people to eat? We only have 5 loaves and 2 fish. And Jesus says, bring them over here to me. It's almost like, he's saying, okay, now let me show you what I can do. Now that you have a full picture and a full understanding that I've given you a task that I know and that you now know that you can't accomplish on your own. And therefore, they're going to be able to see the power of God at work. So this is something that he sets in place for the 12 disciples. Also, again, for the multitude of the crowd, showing them who he is and what he's able to do. Okay. The whole thing is, and again, this is going to go back to the difference a little bit between the 12 disciples and the multitude, is that there's a different sort of reception, of Jesus that takes place between those two groups of people. Now, let me hasten to say that the disciples here, since they passed the test, and that's just my interpretation, I think that Jesus tests them. He tests Philip, and I think Philip and everybody else passed the test. They passed the test by saying, I can't. Okay. That doesn't mean, though, that there isn't a lot of work for the disciples to do. We obviously don't have time to go into detail into all of this, but if you read further in the synoptics, even as you go further into the whole thing about feeding the 4,000, where you're dealing with pretty much an identical situation, some of the details are a little bit different as far as the number of elements and the number of people involved. You have the disciples, singing the same tune and saying, how are we going to do these things? Now, Jesus has already, performed this on 5,000 plus people. Here we're dealing with a less number of people. In the second instance with 4,000, you're kind of wondering, okay, why, the disciples should have gotten this, after what happened with the 5,000. And even with what, what goes on with, them just traveling by themselves and they forgot to bring bread. And, Jesus is one who's like, oh my goodness, why are you guys talking about having no bread? Because Jesus said, beware of the yeast of the Pharisees, right? So the disciples still have a long way to go. But as it relates to this specific instance here, what I would say is that they pass the test. They pass the test by saying and acknowledging, I can't. And really, when you understand, Jesus' consistent message throughout the Gospel of John, and seeing and knowing and understanding that there's no human effort as it relates to salvation. You get that sense with Jesus talking to Nicodemus in John chapter 3, as we saw, and Jesus's interaction with the Samaritan woman in John chapter 4. You can see how this life circumstance here plays into even a gospel message of the inability of man to do something and God being able to do things through Jesus Christ. Okay. And you just consider that even as we go further into chapter 6, we're talking about the bread from heaven, and all of that represents centered on this, again, on this message of the gospel and of salvation. So here we see the inability of man to multiply, as it were, all of these things, I think has a pretty spiritual significance just as it relates to the gospel and the work of God in salvation, as opposed to man's inability to do anything to save himself. Okay, I think that's very interesting there. So back in John here, Philip says, 200 denarii worth of bread would not be enough for each of them to get a little. Then in verses 8 and 9, one of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what are they for so many?" So in the other synoptics, they just came out and said that, we only have five barley loaves and 2 fish. Here it's specific where those 5 loaves and those 2 fish come from a boy who just happened to have those along with him. Now in Mark chapter 6, one of the things that you notice within that whole thing of this miracle of the 5,000 is that Jesus tells the disciples to go and see how many loaves there are. Okay, so he asks, how many loaves are there? Go and see. So he had sent them out to kind of find out, what resources are out there. Now, Jesus already knew that there isn't much out there. Okay, and again, I think that's part of the whole thing of Jesus, God in human flesh, setting up the situation for this message to be told both to his 12 disciples and to everybody else, so that they know and that they understand, that what has happened, what he does here in this situation is totally a work of God. And so they would come back. So if that's the case, then we have here in John, in the process of them going out and finding out what's out there, they find a boy there who has 5 loaves and 2 fish. And really that's all they're able to find, because that's all that they bring that's all that they bring to Jesus. And so Andrew is one who says, "Oh, hey, we found a boy here. He's got 5 loaves and we have 5 barley loaves and 2 fish." But again, his whole thing is again a good setup for what Jesus is going to do, because he says, "But what are they for so many?" Okay, what are they for so many? So in verse 10, Jesus said, "Have the people sit down." Now there was much grass in the place, so this is a comfortable place. We're on the mountain. We're not necessarily talking about, a heavily rocky place necessarily. I mean, it was maybe somewhat rocky, but I mean, you have comfortable spaces there where they were, or perhaps maybe they came back down on the mountain because it says that Jesus withdrew back to the mountain at the end of the passage. That's also possible as well. But, whatever the case, you have this area. It had to have been a spacious place if we're talking about 5,000 people. Of grass where they can all sit down comfortably, so that when it comes time to eat, they can be comfortable in that area where they're sitting. It says, "Now there was much grass in the place, so the men sat down, about 5,000 in number." Now remember, that's just men. We're not including women and children here, so we're talking more than 5,000. I mean, maybe a rough estimate. I mean, obviously we don't know exactly. But I mean, if maybe we want to talk, thinking maybe 15-ish or so thousand people, if we're talking about women and children. I mean, depending on how many children there are and those sorts of things, or maybe even more, who knows? But I mean, that again, like I said, that's a rough estimate. 5,000 in and of itself is a lot of people when you're only talking about 5 loaves and 2 fish. Okay. So even just taking that alone, we're dealing with something significant and amazing. But we know that there are more than 5,000 because we know that there aren't just men there. So we're talking about a whole horde of people here. that Jesus is about to feed here. Verse 11, Jesus then took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated, so also the fish as much as they wanted. Have you noticed here, and I think this is the case even in the synoptics as well, is that even here, again, there isn't this large fanfare when it comes to this miracle. Again, there isn't any sort of, a long-winded, come and multiply, that sort of thing. Jesus gave thanks for the loaves and the fish, which I would guess, if I had to guess, whether you're talking about 5 loaves, 2 fish, or whether you're talking about whatever you had, that I would guess that was standard for Jesus to give thanks to the Father for those resources. But I mean, we're not dealing with anything that has to do with any sort of abracadabra sort of thing with our Lord, or anything like that. When I was looking through this, and that thought was going through my mind when I was preparing for this, it made me think of a cartoon that I saw growing up as a kid, and maybe some of you listening to this might be familiar with it, and maybe you saw that when you were young. But there was a cartoon called Flying House. And it was an animated series about these time traveling kids. I mean, this flying house was essentially a time machine that was invented by Professor Bumble, I believe his name was. And so these were kids who would travel around in New Testament gospel time. So they met Jesus, they knew the 12 disciples and everything like that. And so I remember, and I went and I checked on YouTube, because you can find everything on YouTube these days. And I found the episode that came to my mind, because I seem to have memory of this, where this wasn't so matter of fact as it's laid out here in Scripture, and you get this idea of people's minds of something spectacular must have been seen or something like that for this miracle to take place. And so I found the episode, I found a rerun of it on YouTube, and I watched that scene, and sure enough, the way it was portrayed is that Jesus had like this little small basket that had the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and he lifted it up to heaven, and then all of the sky became aglow, and it was shining this brilliant light, as Jesus gave thanks, and then he gives the baskets to the disciples to hand out. And I'm like, in people's minds, at least the people who made that cartoon, their imagination is to think of something along those lines. But it's just very interesting to me that you don't see that. That's not anything that's laid out in the text. And it's the same thing with some of the other miracles that we've seen in John so far. The changing of the water into wine, remember, that was something where even narratively, John is just like, the water, there's the water and now it's wine, essentially. Jesus didn't pray over the wine. He didn't do some sort of incantation over the wine. At one moment it's water, and the next moment it's wine. With the healing of the invalid, Jesus really doesn't do anything except just to say, hey, get up, take up your mat, and go home. I mean, there wasn't anything, and the same thing here. It just says, and I don't know why it amazes me so much when it's just laid out like that. It just seems so matter of fact, but yet it's matter of fact, but it's so amazing because of the immensity of the miracle. It's just there. Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated. So also the fish, as much as they wanted. Again, that goes back to the whole satisfaction thing. People had their fill. And I've always wondered, because in the synoptics, you get the sense that it was the disciple. I mean, it says that Jesus distributed them, but the idea is that he distributed them through his 12, and the 12 were the ones who were passing out this food. And I just wondered, like, what was that like for the disciples themselves? I mean, just imagine you're going through the crowd and you have your own basket and you're handing out this food, and it just seems like one of those situations where the basket never gets empty. Now, remember, you're feeding a large number of people. That basket is not big enough where it has everything you need, to pass out everything to everybody. From a human perspective, that you would think that basket would get empty eventually, but it doesn't. And so the way that I see it, and the way that help but imagine, because the text doesn't say how it is. It's just like, what was that like? Just every time the disciples reached in, there's always more, there's always more, there's always more, and they keep passing out and passing out and passing out and passing out and passing out these elements here, and they never get to the bottom. And never get to the, I mean, really, literally never get to the bottom. It's not even a matter of a whole thing where they never get to the bottom of this basket until they reach the last person, and then they happen to have just enough to give to that last person that they hand out to. Because as we see here, even as you go on, in verse 12. It says, and when they had eaten their fill, he told his disciples, gather up the leftover fragments that nothing may be lost. All right. So there's leftovers. And so this gives us let me just say this gives us an understanding that Jesus is one who's able to provide and then some. I mean, if he were to provide the exact amount of food for every single person so that they are perfectly satisfied, that would be amazing. But I don't think what we're dealing with here is kind of an over calculation or an oops, I did too much. You ever cooked something and you only meant to cook for so many people, but maybe from a lapse of memory or just a mistake on your part, you actually end up making more than you intended to? That was an accident. You didn't mean to do that. It was like, oops, I made more than what was necessary. That's not what's going on with Jesus here, okay? And I think even the leftovers is supposed to tell us something. As far as needs, as far as man's needs, God is more than capable, and his provisions is more than sufficient to meet needs. Now, again, we're looking at things from the physical here. We're looking at things from the physical as far as physical appetites and foods and that sort of thing. And that definitely is true. Remember, though, what we're going to be transitioning into when we're talking about, the whole thing of bread from heaven and Jesus calling himself the bread of life and that sort of thing. Can Jesus provide more than enough than what we need as it relates to spiritual life and life in him? Absolutely. Absolutely, he can. But here you have this whole thing here. And again, I don't think it's an accident, that there are leftovers. And I think that maybe that's something that even the disciples can take note of. We're talking about 12 basketfuls. Maybe that's 12, one basket for each disciple. Each one of them have baskets that has leftovers. So maybe that's the abundance of the miracle is something that the 12 disciples themselves are supposed to take note of. Perhaps that's a possibility. I'm not really dogmatic about that, but that's a possibility. But whatever the case, we know that God is able to provide and then some. Okay. So given the situation, given the number of people, we see that is something that is truly amazing. So he said, gather up the leftover fragments that nothing may be lost. Verse 13. So they gathered up and filled 12 baskets with fragments from the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten. So actually, just looking at this verse, it looks like in gathering, they kind of, it says there they filled 12 baskets. So maybe it wasn't necessarily a whole thing of they never got down to the bottom of the basket. But I mean, even so, maybe just gathering what had already been distributed. And again, you had people who had their fill, and there were some that are left over that hadn't been touched. And so they go and they gather all of those, and then they filled up 12 basketfuls. That sounds like more likely actually reading that verse, what you're probably dealing with there. But again, that doesn't take away from the point of what you see there is that Jesus provided and then some, okay? And then in verse 14, now here's where we get to, this whole thing of, the crowd's response. The crowd's response is very interesting here. Let's start out with verse 14. It says, when the people saw the sign that he had done, they said, this is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world. Okay. So they acknowledge Jesus as the prophet. Okay. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that in the synoptics, and again, these are in all the areas before the feeding of the 5,000 in those areas in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, where Herod and everybody else is speculating on who this person is. Herod is one who's saying, John the Baptist raised from the dead. And some other people were saying that as well. But, you had people who were saying Elijah or one of the prophets of long ago. So they're thinking of a prophet, right? So there had been speculation that he was a prophet of some sort. Now, once we get done with this miracle in chapter 6, they're saying that he is the prophet. Now, again, we've talked about this whole thing about the prophet before. Who is the prophet? The prophet is one who the Jews were waiting for. It's a the whole designation that's connected to the Messiah. Remember when John the Baptist was doing his baptismal ministry in chapter 1, one of the things that they were saying, one of the things that he was being asked was, are you the prophet? And he answered no. Okay. So that was a question in people's minds. So people were waiting for the prophet who would be the Messiah, right? And so this is somebody that Moses spoke about. Moses spoke of the prophet. I believe we talked about this a little bit when we were talking about chapter 5, and when we were looking at the ending part of chapter 5. If you want the Old Testament reference to that, go back to Deuteronomy 18. That's where Moses talks about the prophet. And the thing that Moses said about the prophet, he says that they must listen to him, and whoever does not listen to the prophet will be cut off from the people. Okay, so here's the thing. These people now, they go from a speculation of Jesus perhaps being a prophet from long ago to the prophet who we've been anticipating this whole time. Now, here's the thing. As the rest of John chapter 6 is going to make evident, they do not listen to the prophet like Moses says that they should. And that's not surprising, because what Jesus has pointed out in John chapter 5 is saying that really at the end of the day, you guys aren't people who listen to Moses. So Moses is one who's saying you need to listen to the prophet. What we're going to see is that even though there's an acknowledgement of the prophet, he's saying this indeed is the prophet who has come into the world. What you see in the rest of chapter 6 is that they don't listen to the prophet, because again, what do you see by the time you get to the end of chapter 6? At the end of chapter 6, you see them turning their backs on him. But notice how this is brought to a close here. In the last verse of our passage here, in verse 15. Perceiving then that they were about to come and take him by force and make him king, Jesus withdrew again to the mountain by himself. Now, here's the thing that we need to understand here. It seems pretty evident by that verse that even though in the previous verse they acknowledge, hey, this is the prophet who is indeed to come into the world, even though they acknowledge that, they still really don't have an understanding fully of who Jesus is, because this isn't a whole thing of, making him king. And that's what Jesus perceived that they wanted to do. They wanted to take him by force to make him king over their whole nation. Which, by the way, Jesus was one who isn't king of just the nation. He's the king of the whole world, and he came to save the whole world. Remember, that's what John the Baptist said. Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world, right? But this is a whole thing where these are people who are installing him or want to install him as king. So you get the sense that they want to grab him, they want to yank him out, and they say, okay, this is how things are going to be. You are going to be our king, and you're going to provide us all the bread and fish that we want and all the bread and fish that we need. That's what Jesus essentially points out to them, saying, when they sought him on the other side of the sea, they said, you didn't come to, to really seek me out. You came because you got your fill of bread and fish, is basically what you're dealing with here. So what you're dealing with here, you're having people who want to make Jesus king, and they don't recognize that Jesus is already king. He is already king, right? You don't have to make him king. He's already king. That indicates that they don't have a full understanding of who they're dealing with, even after what they've done. This was a creative miracle, which should show them that this is God in human flesh. And if we're dealing with God, humans don't have to make God king. He already is king. What did Nathanael say in John chapter 1 when he had his encounter with Jesus? You are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel. Yes, the King of Israel, and also, as we would understand, the whole world. But I mean, looking at it from specifically that Jewish perspective, you are the King of Israel. You are the King, right? When Jesus is asked later on in John, he says, "You've said that I am a king." He admits that he is a king. So nobody has to make him king. These people don't understand that, even after the creative miracle that shows that Jesus is God. Okay, you don't have to make God king. He already is king, right? And they're doing this by force. They want to take him by force and force him into this. And so, and really to force him into this whole thing of being king, take him by force and to make him king, really, this isn't a submission thing. Make him king so that we can submit ourselves to him. It's a whole thing of make him king because we know how much he can do for us. So really, they're going into this with this expectation of the king doing all things for them and serving them, and it's not the other way around. Their mindset was backwards, okay? So when they really get into what is really required of them and what Jesus, lays out for them even further in the text, again, as we're going to go into more detail in chapter 6, we're going to see that it's not what they bargained for, and that's why you see them walking away, by the time you get to the end of chapter 6. But that's really what you're dealing with. And Jesus, knowing that and perceiving that, as it says there, he withdrew again to the mountain by himself. Again, all of this has a positive look to it. But one thing that you can see in this, or maybe you can consider this as a specific replay of, again, what you saw in John chapter 2, at the end of John chapter 2. Remember where it says, now when he was in Jerusalem, now in John chapter 6, again, we're dealing with the up north in Galilee, but here in John chapter 2, now when he was in Jerusalem at the Passover feast, many believed in his name when they saw the signs that he was doing. See that? And one might look at that and say, this is a positive thing. This is a great thing that we're seeing here. People are loving him. People are receiving him, that sort of thing. But as it says there, but Jesus on his part did not entrust himself to them because he knew all people and needed no one to bear witness about man, for he himself knew what was in man. Very same thing here. It's a different scenario, different time of year, different group of people, probably, different location, but you're dealing with the same thing. Here you have people who, we can say at the very least are willing to make him king, even though you don't make him king, and you think this is a positive thing, right? But does Jesus submit to their coronation and say that, yes, okay, I will be your king and that sort of thing? No, he withdrew again to the mountain by himself. Why is that? Chapter 6 makes it pretty plain and evident. But, essentially what you're dealing with is Jesus knew all people, and he knew what was truly in their hearts. And he draws that out so that by the time, again, I feel like I'm a broken record. Again, by the time you get to the end of chapter 6, you see what happens, and they all desert him except the 12. Okay. So what is it about Jesus's words in this long discourse that we're going to sort of dip our toes into next time? Not so much next time, because there's other things that happen up to this point. We're going to have a little bit of a setup of that discourse, but we can start asking the question now, what is it that Jesus is eventually going to say that turns people off? There's a lot of richness in here in this passage of John chapter 6. Can't wait to go into all of it with you, but whatever it is, we know that it's not very popular, and we're going to talk about it, and we're going to discuss and see why that is the case. And we're even going to get a glimpse, even next time as we continue on in our passage, of really how hard-hearted these people are. Even just with what they ask of Jesus at that point when they find him on the other side. Okay? So that's what we're going to start to get into. A lot of good things that are coming up. We will leave it there for now. So hopefully this serves as a good setup of what we're going to see in the rest of the chapter. Okay, and I hope you're prepared for what we're going to get into. So it's going to be some good stuff. Okay, so I will remind you as we go ahead and bring this to a close again that if you haven't done so already, go ahead and follow and subscribe wherever you listen to this podcast. Also, remember to follow me on X. The handle is at LTScripts. That's LTSERIPTS, which stands for Loving the Scriptures. And again, order a copy of my book, Signs of the End. What did Jesus say about his own return and the events that point to it? All right, friends. Well, I had a great time going through this passage with all of you. I think we're going to have all the more great fun going through this chapter and just mining out the richness of what we encounter here, what Jesus says here. Truly, truly wonderful things. I hope you come back and join me for that analysis as well. My name is Steve Gill, and I will see you right back here next time.